Hey everybody, this is Greg Day, Performance Sports Physio, and
Rod Harris, osteopath.
we are in Makuhari, Tokyo, Japan.
And we were having a little conversation and we thought, you know what, we should actually record this.
Yeah, and it came back to a topic of core strength, which we think is a very poorly phrased statement.
Well, it's even broader than that, isn't it? Because the current paradigm is that we just add strength to everything.
Yeah.
So if everything's strong, it should work well.
Yeah.
And by that, I think everyone means the tissues themselves should be strong, as opposed to our ability to express strength or express capacity, which is a totally different question altogether.
Yeah. Core stability and core strength is not the same thing. Being strong doesn't imply the ability or the behavior to be stable.
Mm-hmm.
And stable is not even all that desirable if you just think of stable as being still. We
Yep.
could call that static stability,
Yep.
but there's another element which is dynamic stability, which is the ability to control motion in one plane while we're resisting it in other planes. And that occurs with every movement that we have. And the variations in the context of life suggest that you're going to have a different behavior of how stable you are or how controlled you are through the trunk, the core, the pillar, whatever language we decide to use. And it's not necessarily going to be, or it's very, very rarely going to be, a demand for high strength.
And we can really sum up what we're saying to put it in context to begin with, just by saying, we're talking about, are you talking to us about just getting strong, or have you considered sequencing and timing first?
Yeah, sequencing and timing are two phrases that relate to a topic researched called motor control. And in the literature, there is about 10 times as much motor control research than there is strength and conditioning research. And I can tell you that the strength and conditioning research is very difficult to keep up with. If you were to follow sports scientists on Twitter, which I do, and I'm following the people that are revealing interesting strength and conditioning research to me as a clinician, and I can't keep up with the volume of research that's coming out to read it. And yet the motor control research is about 10 times as much over history. So it is challenging if you're looking to try to simplify what is a very complex and a very widely studied area. It's challenging to bring that down to a simple paradigm, and yet it's been done beautifully by Schmidt and Lee in their book Motor Control and Learning. And they talk about three elements that are consistent with something called a central pattern generator, or in their words, a general movement pattern.
Yeah, so if you hear us refer to GMP, we mean generalized movement pattern or general movement pattern.
Yeah, and it's synonymous with a centralized pattern generator. So these are fundamental movement software programs that are written in our central nervous system, and that they underpin a wide variety of movements.
And the what underpins this is research proving that muscles don't actually have memory.
Yeah.
So we should be talking not about muscle memory, but instead about motor memory before we even talk about strength and adding capacity to people.
Yeah, and muscle memory.
Well, there is an epigenetic component of that, but that takes it a lot further.
Muscles don't remember movement.
That's correct.
They have a genetic ability to respond to the movement patterns and the stimuluses that are generated from the central nervous system. So if you've previously been exposed to that, then you will respond quicker when you are re-exposed to it.
Yeah.
That's the muscle having a genetic
Or
adaptation,
epigenetic in that case.
an epigenetic adaptation to respond to stimulus, but they don't remember movement. That comes from the central nervous system.
Correct. So we probably should talk about what a general movement pattern is first.
Okay.
And what three things make that up. Because if you don't understand that, then adding capacity to someone is potentially useless and at worst risky.
Yeah, so let's take something complex and turn it into simple. There's three things that a central pattern generator, or a GMP, a generalized movement pattern, has. The first one is that there is relatively invariable sequencing, which means a particular muscle will activate first, followed by another muscle, etc. So in each pattern of movement, that's the sequence that's there, and it doesn't change. Even with the subtle variations in movement, that's the sequence that occurs.
Yeah. So as you guys might even notice on the video here, Greg's been doing this with his hand. That's a generalized motor pattern. And he could actually add more speed to that, or he could add more amplitude to that, but it doesn't actually change the sequencing of the muscles, and it doesn't change the timing, which is about how long a muscle stays under contraction.
Yeah, that's our second component of a GMP or a CGP, is that there's relatively invariable timing. So a muscle will stay active for a particular time, followed by the second muscle in the sequence, which is our first point, and it will stay active for a particular period of time, and that may be 2/3 shorter or 4/10 faster or longer or something, etc. And then the third element is that there is a relatively invariable distribution of forces between each of these muscles, which means that if that muscle was to activate with a amplitude of 1, then the one that's following it may have an amplitude that's 40% greater. So it'll be a stronger contraction relative to that one, and the one following it could be only 70% of the first one.
Yep, correct.
And when you have to run that movement pattern against force, an external force, for example, the whole 1.4, 0.7 amplitudes up, so the ratios stay the same. So that relative force distribution is the same. So just summarize, our three components are
Sequencing,
yep,
timing,
yep,
and
force
relative
distribution.
force.
Yeah. Now, clinically, that's impossible to detect, and yet our industry has many times attempted to do so.
Yes.
Here's an example.
With an alarming lack of success.
It's horrible because it's not reliable, and it doesn't have validity. Now, I know there's lots of different types of validity.
And the biggest problem is that it's not transferable. In other words, even if we are good enough to detect this as clinicians, does that actually help the person motor learn? And we're going to argue no.
It doesn't.
And does that mean that when they get out to real life, which is random because you're using a controlled environment in the clinic, can they actually replicate the learnings? And the motor learning research clearly says no if you're trying to do it that way.
Let's look at an example. A person lays prone, and because you've read some research that says that the lumbar multifidus is a segmental stabilizer and it should be a primary activator before limb movement, right? We've seen large amounts of that research. So you get someone prone and you palpate their lumbar multifidus or their erector spinae. You should be able to get the depth. I'm digressing. You palpate the glute max and you palpate the hamstring, and you ask the person to perform hip extension. Theoretically, you should get a segmental proximal stabilization first, followed by a distal mobilization, which would include lumbar multifidus activating first. Because the glute max has got a little bit of SIJ stabilization, which is proximal, you probably should get that in concert with, and then hamstring should activate hip extension with glute max. Now, if you palpate that, you've got to have some pretty wicked skills to be able to detect what goes first, how long after, and which one fires to the right amount.
Yep. And let's even assume that your skills are good enough.
Let's assume you can do that.
Let's just say you can do it. Okay, so for the sake of argument, you can. Is that useful for that person? What are you actually teaching them to do? You're teaching them to isolate how to extend their hip when they're in a prone position.
Yeah, which changes as soon as they move into a different position.
Exactly.
Part one. And two is you've put the horse before the cart in so much as, what if you make a clinical decision that says, that's out of sequence, and you know what, the timing's off, and so's the force distribution. Typically, our industry has said, let's jump to trying to get that person to activate the multifidus better, or not more, just at 30% of MVC. And so again, you've missed the problem. Is it, if you're accurate, if we've assumed, is that because if you've said that the timing's off and the sequence off and the force distribution is off, is that because they have an underlying pain, which is changing motor control, or they have a mobility restriction, which is affecting...
Which means they can't get into hip extension anyway.
They can't get to hip extension.
Can't get it.
And so they lumbar extend, which causes a massive erector spinae component, etc. So you've missed pain, you've missed a mobility restriction and an inputs problem, and you're measuring outputs using a faulty technique.
Yes.
So we have sequencing, timing, relative force distribution.
And remember, you actually have to be able to palpate and distinguish all three.
Correct.
And I've never seen anyone who could do that, despite being around some of the best palpators on earth.
Yeah. So we bring this up because motor control is complex, and it's been simplified down to three things, and even they are too complex to be able to clinically assess. So we changed that a few years back, and we said, do you know, how can you encapsulate what timing, sequencing, and force distribution looks like? Well, the way that you do that is you should know what a CPG looks like within a bandwidth of variation. So these CPGs will have a little bit of variation. Me picking this cup up could be slightly variable depending on which angle I come at.
So just explaining the acronym, CPG.
Central pattern generator.
Cool.
Okay.
which
So-
is the same as a GMP.
So there's some variation, but you should know that if that movement pattern goes outside that variation, we consider that to be beyond the realms of a normal CPG.
Yep.
Now that takes some training. Luckily, you don't have to reinvent that.
Yeah.
Some brilliant minds have mapped these things. Okay. Now that still requires you to make a call, and here's what it turns out: a CPG or a GMP that has appropriately minimum levels of competency of sequencing, timing, and force distribution. How does that look in 2 words?
Clean and easy.
Clean and easy. It's clean because the sequence flows. It's easy because there's not an excessive effort or loss of control that requires more effort. So you get this clean and easy. And so once that movement pattern falls outside the bandwidth of acceptable or a normal CPG, it changes from clean and easy to the opposite. Opposite of clean is dirty or
Dirty and difficult.
dirty and difficult. So movement can be viewed as being clean and easy or dirty and difficult, and we step into correct when it becomes dirty and difficult.
And before we go any further here, we should say, let's just give you an example of two people doing a squat. If someone pings a really good squat, my experience is people will still argue about how to make that look better. Okay, so in other words, they ignore the performance bandwidth.
It's because they're trying to give someone what they want to do rather than what that person needs.
And the other thing that happens is if you get someone next to them who has a really poor squat, everyone can pick the poor movement.
Yeah.
So one of the things we want to say here is that when we're talking clean and easy and dirty and difficult, it's with a little bit of training and some parameters to use, we find everyone can really do it really well, can work out
Quite
very
quickly.
quickly what's clean and easy and what's dirty and difficult.
Yeah.
And we're very, very consistent across each examiner.
So let's circle back to where we started this video, which was in core strength. A lot of people are saying it's essential that you have a strong core. And what we're saying is, no. There is only one circumstance where you need to have strong muscles or strong tissue behaving in a way that resists very, very high force. And we call that a high threshold strategy. And there's only one circumstance or one category. And that is when you need to develop immeasurable energy to resist an immovable force. And an example would be if you're a front rower in a rugby
I was going
match,
to say a rugby tackle or a mixed martial arts takedown defense.
you have a 120 kilogram individual running fast at you. Now the force is immeasurable. It's maybe measurable. And you need to be an immovable object.
Yeah.
So you need to generate extraordinary stiffness and strength throughout the entire body. That's a high threshold strategy. That is where you need to bring everything up to maximum outputs.
Yep.
For control of movement against load, not just control of movement without load, you don't need that high threshold strategy. You need reflexive control as the perturbations disturb you. If I do that, you just had a reflex control.
So if we take that example further with a footballer, he wants me to push him back. If we took that further with a footballer, who would you say is the more effective athlete? Let's say there's Greg and I. Okay, we'll use an example. We're both trying to resist that tackle. Greg can use that high threshold strategy, and that's all he can do. I also have to use that high threshold strategy at the point of impact, but because I've got good sequencing, timing, and relative force distribution, I can relax in a moment and change my force and redirect that player somewhere else. So that means that I can keep running or I can complete a tackle if I need to. Who's the best athlete?
Typically, you wouldn't do that consciously. That's a reflex-driven activity.
Correct.
Now, reflexes are done beneath the level of consciousness. You can't initiate a reflex with conscious thought.
In other words, not talking about any particular exercise modalities, but if I have to think about contracting my core before I pick up a pen off the
It's too
ground,
late.
something has gone wrong.
Yeah.
Something's gone wrong.
And the moment you get distracted, you can't do that. So training conscious core control is not what's required.
It's useful in what we call block training to begin with, but then it needs to go to random and unconscious control.
Yeah. So we're going to give you a strategy. We're not going to just say it's futile. That's not exactly what we're saying. We're saying core control is the underpinning of athletic endeavors and performance and behaviors, not core strength, unless you need to be an immovable object against an immeasurable force. So core control, and it's reflex driven, not conscious driven. So let's go back a step. What supports reflexes is input from mechanoreceptors modulated by central nervous system tracts up and down the spinal cord,
Yep.
etc. But effectively, you have to have a very, very, very healthy input from your periphery into the central nervous system, so the central nervous system can detect it and say,
It has the
we
appropriate
just,
information available.
yes, it's
Yep.
got necessary inputs. Then it sufficiently processes it.
Yep.
What does that mean? It says, okay, we have detected movement exquisitely quickly, and we need to stabilize against that or allow it to occur
Yep.
in a controlled fashion. That happens so quickly that you can't generate a thought in response to it. That reflex is not trained by doing conscious exercise. It's trained by removing any barriers to that input loop happening. Leave the best computer alone in the universe to do what it does fantastically, which is to sufficiently process this in a way that you and I could never coach. So get out of its way by taking away pain, toxins, ill health, mobility restrictions, and then create a circumstance through exercise that challenges the person's ability to use that reflex.
So let's kind of summarize it and bring this around a little bit. Can we see that proprioceptive input going on?
No,
Can we see sufficient processing going on?
absolutely.
How do we see it, Greg?
Through
And
a
this is
movement
important.
pattern.
Exactly. We see it through the output, and we've just talked about the fact that with some guidance and some parameters, it's very quick to determine what looks good within a performance bandwidth and what looks bad. So we've got clean and easy, dirty and difficult. So we use that output to measure actually what's happening, because we can't measure the inputs, and in fact, we can't even see how the processing is occurring. We can just see the result of the processing.
Yeah. Look, we've used big words here, a lot of technical capabilities. It is very complex, but you can simplify it down to clean and easy, dirty and difficult. That we look at the outputs. They tell us whether the central nervous system is sufficiently processing inputs. And if it's not, we have these systematic processes to say we need to change inputs. That's the essence of performance physical therapy.
Yep.
And then the great essence of rehabilitation and coaching is to cue this processing so that it gets organized in a way as to regain that output in a way. That's the fun part.
And what we want to do is we want to make it really clear that even if you don't have the skills to be able to do that yet, that's okay. But what we want to say is don't go and add capacity to a motor control problem, because that's going to cause people, at worst, it's going to be fairly useless because it's still a performance roadblock. At worst, it can actually create potential injuries and pain.
So core strength, you're saying it wrong almost all of the time.
Core motor control is a better way of looking at it.
Yeah. Core motor control is the correct terminology. Core
Uh,
strength, nope.
And also because it will lead you into the most appropriate pathway, which is get timing and sequencing and relative force production right first before you start trying to add strength to the tissues, or in a general sense, you're trying to add capacity. So get all the building blocks right first, capacity comes last.
There's three benefits of getting all those things right. You have enhanced performance. We could discuss that in a longer period of time. You have improved efficiency. And potentially you have improved safety. And those are the only three reasons that you really should step into somebody if you find that they're outside the parameters that we're talking about. If someone's dirty and difficult, you say, just leave them alone, it'll be fine, it's no big deal.
Or just add capacity and expect that it's going to
Sure.
change, because that's something
Capacity
we often
will
see.
make them better. And you
Yeah.
say, once you've made a decision that a person is outside the realms of normal variation, and they've now slipped into a dirty and difficult movement pattern, your choice to change that is for three reasons. It's because if you don't change it, the likelihood of success is lower.
Much lower.
If you don't change it, that person has to work harder to replicate this movement over and over again. That's called efficiency. And the third one is that increases their use of resources through efficiency, which may bring on a fatigue onset earlier, and could be, which is a risk factor for injury.
And we would say that they tend to be the less robust athletes.
Sure, they draw on more resources. Okay, that doesn't mean that they will. You could say, well, let's just get them fitter. Sure, but that teaches them to compensate, not necessarily to be better.
So if they come up against someone who doesn't need to compensate, who has just as much capacity, that could be a problem for them.
Run rings around them. So core strength, you're saying it wrong most of the time.
And there's one more thing we need to add that's really, really important, because the motor control research is incredibly clear on this. If we give somebody a poor movement pattern, what happens to them, Greg?
It saves in their nervous system. You can never get rid of
You
it.
can never get rid of it. So you can either be part of the problem or you can be part of the solution. You can help people establish good movement patterns, or you can be part of the problem and either allow someone to maintain a poor movement pattern, or indeed, if you don't know how to do this stuff properly, you can actually create a worse movement pattern. And that's stored forever. It can't go away.
Yeah, and you're charging people to make them worse, so that's not cool.
I think we need to go and join the seminar.
Yeah, we're going to a seminar here in Japan, so catch you later.
Bye, guys.